All right, well, please join me in the Gospel of John. We're in John chapter 2 this morning. We're going to be looking at verses 12 through 22 in John 2. That's page 887 in the blue ESV Bible and the seatbacks out there. John 2, 12 through 22. The title of the sermon is Cleaning House. One of my favorite music albums is called Reinventing the Wheel by Andy Gullahorn. And it's full of sort of funny and ironic songs. One of them is an ode to a toe that he lost in a lawnmower accident. He called it Roast Beef after the children's rhyme, I guess. And so I like the album, but it's the next to the last song that I want to tell you about this morning. It's called Holy Ground. And the opening verse describes an abandoned Catholic church building with a good half inch of dust built up on the pews. There are pieces missing from the stained glass dove, and one of the basement doors has a broken lock such that if one pushed it hard enough, you could get inside. Well, one brutally cold winter, a few homeless people did just that. They got inside the church building through said semi-locked door and laid their sleeping bags on the altar rail. It was holy ground, the chorus repeats. Well, word got out and the sanctuary filled. At night, they would come inside and eat and drink together, activities they were all accustomed to do alone. One guy could kind of play the piano, and so he plays a hymn on the out-of-tune piano with a few keys that didn't even work. And again, the singer reflects, it was holy ground. Well, eventually, the local priest got word of the vagrants in the empty church, and he was told to go to the house of God and clear them out because, after all, it was holy ground. They didn't need to be in there. And so he shows up at the door, and he's greeted by a man who says, "Welcome to the one place where we all belong." And the priest, he hears laughter down the hall. He sees the smiling man, and he's unwilling to ask them to leave. And so he shares a meal with them and even asks to stay the night out of solidarity, I guess, because it was holy ground. Now, you may be thinking that the song portrays a nice sentiment, but it's a bit naive and simplistic. Perhaps you're thinking that the song foolishly sanitizes the invasion of someone else's property, wrongly assumes only good motives of the homeless, and seems to suggest that the only reason someone would not want to have a bunch of homeless people squatting in a church building, even an abandoned one, is due to an improper sense of what constitutes holy ground. And I'd agree with you. But every time I hear the song, I am challenged by his ironic use of the phrase, holy ground. And it compels me to ask the question, what does constitute holy ground? Is an abandoned church building that simply collects dust holy ground? Because that's what church buildings are in and of themselves, regardless of how they're being used or not. In asking this question of myself and posing it to you this morning, to be clear, I am not suggesting in any way that churches should leave their buildings unlocked and allow anybody that wants to live inside to set up camp. But that song and its refrain about holy ground, it leads me to ask the same kinds of questions that John 2 poses as Jesus drives merchants and money changers out of the temple. Fundamentally, John 2 is about holy ground. It's about holy worship, to be more accurate. John 2:12 through 22 teaches us that worship matters. And the way in which we worship matters. Let me read the passage, and then I'll outline the sermon. Beginning in verse 12. After this, the wedding feast at Cana and all that happened there. After this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother and his brothers and his disciples, and they stayed there a few days. The Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple, he found those who were selling oxen and sheep and pigeons, and the money changers sitting there. And making a whip of cords, he drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and oxen. And he poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. And he told those who sold the pigeons, "Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of trade." His disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." So the Jews said to him, "What sign do you show us for doing these things?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews then said, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and will you raise it up in 3 days?" But he was speaking about the temple of his body. When therefore he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. There are just two things that I want to highlight for us this morning in this passage as we consider the importance of worship and the importance of rightly ordered worship. The first thing is that we see the importance of rightly ordered worship in Jesus' authoritative cleansing of the old temple. And then second, we see it in Jesus' sacrificial death and resurrection as the new and better temple. So the first thing that we see in this passage is that Jesus demonstrates authority over the old temple as he warns against the corruption that had grown within the practices of worship in his day. After the wedding feast in Cana and the first public manifestation of his glory in the first 11 verses, we're told that Jesus went down to Capernaum with his mother and his brothers and his disciples, and they stayed there a few days. John then tells us that Jesus went up to Jerusalem at Passover time, and he entered the temple, and he found there those who were selling oxen and sheep and pigeons. And he also found money changers. Passover was a major Jewish holiday commemorating the Exodus, where the angel of death passed over the homes with blood on the doorpost in the prescribed manner, but killing the firstborn in all the other homes. And the Jews would sojourn each year from various places of residence throughout the world to Jerusalem to celebrate. And as they came, they had tithes and offerings and sacrifices to make. But rather than traveling halfway around the world with oxen and sheep and pigeons to slaughter, they would simply bring money and buy the animals there in Jerusalem. And there's a precedent for this kind of thing. In Deuteronomy 14, God told Israel that he would pick a place each year. This is before the temple was built, where they would worship him and the people would go there to tithe to the Lord. And he tells them in essence that if the way is too long for you to bring the tithe, bring money. Turn the tithe into money, bring the money, and then buy the tithe when you get there. Oxen, sheep, strong drink when you're closer. And so in principle, there doesn't seem to be anything wrong with the practice of exchanging money, buying and selling animals for sacrifice nearer to the temple for those who had come a long way. In fact, it was a logistical kindness to those coming from a long way to be able to purchase in Jerusalem what they would need for the offering. Imagine trying to bring all of that with you. It'd be a nightmare. And yet, Jesus has a problem with it. How do I know that? Because he made a whip of cords and drove them all out. He had a major problem with it. He turned over the tables and he poured out their coins. And he told those who sold the pigeons, mercifully, he didn't seem to let them out of their cages. He just told them, "Take them and go. Do not make my Father's house a house of trade." What was it that offended Jesus about this scene? Well, as I said, it's almost certainly not the practice in itself, as if he had found them down the road from the temple, that he would have done this. John tells us he's found them in the temple. Well, to know why that's such a big deal, we need to ask, what was the temple for? It was the place where God's people could come to worship him. It was a place where common ground became holy ground. It was space singularly devoted to the worship of the holy God. It's not that marketplaces are bad, but the temple was not the place, it was not the location for such commerce, even religiously motivated commerce. So Jesus says, don't turn my Father's house into a house of trade, into a marketplace, into a bazaar. This was a massive thing. Like the temple was a massive place. The Temple Mount covered about 35 acres. This was a massive undertaking. Hundreds of thousands of people came into Jerusalem, flooded the temple court. Some estimates 10xing the population, the resident population at the time. This was a massive thing. Many, many people, many animals, lots of exchanging going on. And it was in the outer court of the Gentiles where this market was set up, where the God-fearers could come and pray. You see, the Jews had turned the whole affair into a commercialized moment of comfortable convenience. You have sacrifices to make? Sure. Come on in, buy your sheep, walk it over to the altar, slit its throat, and off you go. It was efficient. Get in and get out. It worked well for those who didn't want to hang about. But it would have been wildly distracting, to say the least, for anyone who was attempting to pray and to worship the Lord in earnest for all of this to be going on. They had merchandised and commercialized the house of God. And they were hindering others from worshiping God. And Jesus is not a fan. So he makes a whip of cords. But it's important that we see this is not an act of rash violence. This is not Jesus exploding in anger, uncontrolled anger. In fact, Jesus doing this is not all that surprising at all if you think about some things from the Old Testament. In Zechariah 14, we read of a dramatic foretelling of a final cataclysmic siege on Jerusalem. It's a horrible event. It's cut short only by the Lord's intervention as he establishes his universal reign and restores holiness in his house. The chapter ends with a statement, 14:21. And there shall no longer be a traitor, T-R-A-D-E-R, not traitor, a traitor in the house of the Lord on that day. So when Jesus comes into the temple, he sees the organized chaos of the commerce going on around him in this supposed holy place that was devoted to the worship of God. He calls Zechariah 14 to mind and says, "Don't make my Father's house a house of trade." But that's probably not the only passage that he has in mind. Malachi 3, 1-4 says this: "Behold, I send my messenger, and he will prepare the way before me." Elsewhere, that's applied to John the Baptist. But then we read this: "And the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple. And the messenger of the covenant in whom you delight, behold, he is coming, says the Lord of hosts. But who can endure the day of his coming? And who can stand when he appears? For he is like a refiner's fire and like fuller's soap. He will sit as a refiner and purifier of silver, and he will purify the sons of Levi and refine them like gold and silver, and they will bring offerings in righteousness to the Lord. Then the offering of Judah and Jerusalem will be pleasing to the Lord, as in the days of old and as in former years." So what's going on here? The point is that at least an aspect of Jesus' messianic assignment, which he undoubtedly understood, was that of purifying the house of God. But I don't think he's the only one who connects these dots. Perhaps picking up on the Zechariah reference. Because at some level, the Jews with whom he's speaking, they seem to realize this whole thing is a symbolic gesture. It's not merely the furious rage of a disillusioned religious zealot. There's something bigger at play here, because they ask him, "Give us a sign. What sign do you show us for doing these things? Prove to us, man, that you are acting in God's name and power. Prove to us that you are the one that God has sent to clean house." Sure, that was impressive, divine even. One man with a whip clearing out that size of an area. But give us a sign. Give us some real proof. Dance for us, puppet. It was not mere violent force that Jesus used here to expel them from the temple. It was moral power. There was something clear to the Jewish leaders in the actions of Jesus. He was not merely turning over tables in anger. He was making a bold claim of authority. He had the right to do this. And so they ask him, "Well, what right is that? What right do you have to be rearranging the furniture in here, man?" Well, whose house is it? It's his Father's house. It's his house. Jesus is the Lord himself, come to his own house. And what does he find? He finds corrupted worship practices where the Jews had mingled the holy and the mundane. They were not taking God's purity seriously. And they were hindering the Gentiles from engaging in undistracted worship of God. And so Jesus authoritatively, as the owner of the house, says, "Get out." So worship matters. And Jesus shows us this by this show of authority. But we see a second thing. Worship matters. And Jesus proves this to us not by simply clearing out the corruption of the old house, but coming to establish a new house altogether. And here we can consider a bit more about the disciples. We've seen his interactions with the Jews a little bit, but what about his disciples? John frames this whole second paragraph there with the mindset and the memory of the disciples. In verse 17, after he said, "Don't make my Father's house a house of trade," the disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." And then he's asked about giving a sign, and he mentions destroying this temple, and he's mocked for it, and then his disciples remember later on. So what's going on in the minds of Jesus' disciples? What connection are they making with Psalm 69:9? Zeal for your house will consume me. They remember that verse. Well, I think the connection they make is probably different than the one that John makes in writing. It's not exactly clear what connection they make. John doesn't spell it out for us. He doesn't tell us what they thought about Psalm 69:9 when they remembered it. Zeal for your house will consume me. But the fact that John only includes half of the verse might be telling, especially given the tendency of people to misunderstand Jesus. As one commentator put it, they're likely focused on the zeal part, not the being consumed part. See, the idea of the Messiah coming in zeal to clean house, make a whip, drive out all the sinners, would likely have been kind of exciting for the disciples. It was a common expectation that the Messiah would be a revolutionary. They expected him not just to take up a whip, but probably a sword and clear out not their friends, but their enemies. He was going to lead a revolt against Rome. The disciples may have been tempted already to misunderstand the purpose of this Messiah. Think about what we saw last time we were in John, 2 weeks ago. What had he just done? He just performed a miraculous sign at the wedding in Cana. He had made the wine flow. He had made the joy flow. He had proven that Jesus is a good time. And what seems to be a few days later, he takes charge in the temple, and they think, Jesus sure is zealous for the house of God. But what is Psalm 69 about? Psalm 69 is a psalm of lament. It begins with the psalmist crying out to God for salvation. Save me, O God, for the waters have come up to my neck. I sink in deep mire where there is no foothold. Verses 1 and 2. Verse 4 says, more in number than the hairs of my head are those who hate me without cause. Mighty are those who would destroy me, those who attack me with lies. He goes on in verses 6 to 8, for it is for your sake that I have borne reproach, that dishonor has covered my face. I have become a stranger to my brothers, an alien to my mother's sons. Only then does he say in verse 9, for zeal for your house has consumed me. But then he adds, and the reproaches of those who reproach you have fallen on me. One more. He says in verses 19 to 21 on this theme of reproach. He says, you know my reproach and my shame and my dishonor. My foes are all known to you. Reproaches have broken my heart so that I am in despair. I looked for pity, but there was none, and for comforters, but I found none. They gave me poison for food, and for my thirst they gave me sour wine to drink. He does go on, the verses after that, to pray that God would return the evil of his enemies on their own heads. But the bulk of the prayer is simply a cry for deliverance. It's a lamentation over the reproach and the shame that the psalmist bears because he is devoted to God's name and to God's house. So what does it actually mean that zeal for God's house is going to consume Jesus? If you keep all of Psalm 69 in mind, it's not quite the swashbuckling image that we might have of Jesus as he clears out the temple. Some images we have, especially probably if you watch any movies about it, you kind of imagine Jesus just sort of flipping over some tables very politely. But on the other side, we might yeah, this is our guy. He's cracking whips. He's shoving people, and he's yelling and screaming, and he's the man. He's being consumed. And so it's not Jesus necessarily strong and mighty here all the way through. There is that. He has authority to do this. But there's something else going on here. And so I think we need to be careful before viewing it as some explicit invitation, especially for us, to start braiding whips and turning over tables. I think this is clear when in Jesus' response, the Jews demand a sign. What sign do you show us for doing these things? Jesus says, you want a sign? I'm not a marionette. So no, but I will tell you this. I will tell you where you can find a sign, find the sign that I am sent from God. Destroy this temple and I will raise it up in 3 days. And as the disciples remember later, he's not ultimately talking about the physical temple. The physical temple does get destroyed, and so he is in some way referencing that, but he's talking about his body. And so contrary to popular opinion, probably his own disciples' opinion, the true Messiah, the whole point of this, the true Messiah was not going to stir up a violent uprising. He didn't crack a whip and turn over tables so that he could go and recruit his masculine warriors to take down Caesar. The whole thing is meant to bring about his death. That's why he does this. And it does bring about his death. Zeal for God's house consumes him, literally. In about 3 years from this event, he is going to die in humiliation and shame for the sake of God's house. As something of a brief aside, there's some debate about how many times Jesus cleansed the temple. The question is John describing the same event here that the synoptics do, seemingly placing it at the end of his ministry? I'll argue about it later if you want, but I think it's 2 cleansings. He visits the temple here in John 2 at the beginning of his ministry, and he pronounces a warning. And he comes again at the end of his ministry and finds that nothing has changed. And so he pronounces a curse on the den of robbers. And as I said, when you know it, 40 years later, the whole thing came down and remains so to this day. I think we can, it's just easy to go one side or the other with this, the fury and the power of Jesus here. Some seem to totally miss it, and sometimes we want to be too focused on how great of a move this was for Jesus. But in human terms, the whole thing comes off as a loss. He cleansed the temple, but what's the result? Reproach, humiliation, and shame that eventually culminates in his death. Look at how they respond to him. 46 years it took us to build this thing. You're going to raise it up in 3 days? Get out of here. That's it. Conversation's over. From all we can tell, that's the last word. Mocking scorn. You are crazy, man. Get out of here. They laugh him out. But John helps us. He helps us to see what's going on here. He frames the conversation in the mindset of the disciples. At the time, it seems, they remembered Psalm 69 when he said it, but then also their memory later on. Hey, I know what he was actually talking about that whole time. They connected the dots somehow with Psalm 69 before, but afterward, way afterward, after his death and resurrection, they got the bigger picture. They probably were baffled at the time. They're thinking, zeal, yes. And then Jesus just gets laughed out of the temple. But after he was raised from the dead, they understood that he wasn't really talking about the physical structure of the temple. He had something else, something deeper in mind. The whole point of this episode is that Jesus' devotion to the right worship of God consumes him as he bears the reproach of God's people all the way to his death and becomes a new and better temple in his resurrection. Jesus was mocked and scorned all the way from the temple to the cross. And there, on the cross, the temple of his body was destroyed in a final offering to God. The animals have been driven out once and for all. The sacrifice has been made, and our shame has been borne and carried away. This doesn't mean that you're never going to feel shame, either justly or unjustly, but it does mean, Christian, that the final word about you is not unworthy. It is not outcast. It's not dirty, filthy, and vile. It's not unclean. Reproach is not the final word for you. What is the final word? It is welcome. It is whole, accepted, made clean. And as Jesus has arisen in new life as the temple that was to replace the one that was coming down, he is now the place where God is pleased to dwell with man. And all who put their faith in Jesus are united to him, and they are joined to this temple. It's not just that Jesus is the temple, so are we. Living stones, Peter says. You see, Jesus didn't just clear out and destroy the old temple in judgment, but now he refines and cleanses the new temple, his body, in love. So the first question of many in closing, have you been united to Jesus by faith, and so cleansed and purified and made fit to enter and enjoy the presence of God? That's where it all leads. Look at the very end of verse 22. They believed the scripture and the word he had spoken. This is the result again. It was later on, but both the wedding at Cana and the temple cleansing, in some very real sense, that's the result. Faith. And so we're going to be asked this over and over again in John's gospel, but have you believed? Have you professed faith in the Lord? Have you believed in him and so been joined to the temple as a living stone? If so, where are you feeling the cleansing power of the Lord in your life right now? And are there areas in your life where you're trying to keep him back from doing his refining work? Your marriage, your parenting, your work, the words that you use, your screen time, both time spent and content. Brothers and sisters, are you daily presenting your bodies as a living sacrifice and holy and acceptable to God? If so, then in a real manner, you're standing on holy ground. Wherever you go is holy ground, Christian. You've been sanctified, set apart for service to God. People can get too carried away with this idea, but it's true. All of our lives are worship. Every moment of every day, we're worshiping. Are we worshiping God, or are we living for creature comforts? Well, it's true that all of our life is worship, but I want to ask some questions here about corporate worship, about our worship together. on the Lord's Day. This building isn't the temple, but it is the place where we've designed to worship together. So some questions are fitting. Before the questions, here's some good news. We're not selling animals for sacrifice. We're not constantly fundraising during worship. We don't have a full-blown coffee bar out in the front. I don't think you could reasonably mistake our Sunday morning worship gatherings for a marketplace. The Keurig and bookshelf over there perhaps notwithstanding. But as we think about those things, are we engaging in distracted or commercialized worship as we gather on the Lord's Day? Do you take worship seriously? Is it obvious that you take worship seriously? Do you prepare for worship the morning of or even the night before? Or do you find yourself regularly, as a rule, showing up tired, late, frazzled? We've all got lots of kids. It's hard to get here, no doubt. But what are we aiming for? Could anyone reasonably suspect from the way you conduct yourself during the worship hour that you're not that interested in worshiping God? That is, could someone walk in here on any given Sunday, look at you, and wonder, what is he even doing here? Do you conduct yourself in such a way that might lead someone to believe that you are primarily, or worse, merely here to socialize out front, pick up a good theological book, drink a free cup of coffee? Or is it clear that we are here to lift the cup of salvation and drink freely from the grace of God? What about our conversations before and after worship? Are they filled primarily with words about the mundanities of life and work? Or are they filled with Christ and His kingdom and His glory? I don't mean that we need to be just quoting Bible verses at each other on the Lord's Day. And if I ever hear you not just quoting Scripture, you're going to get in trouble. But am I shouting at my family before the service and complaining about my job afterward? What am I eager to talk with you about when we have those few minutes before and after worship? Forget what other people can see. What are you doing in the privacy of your own heart during worship? Well beyond the sight and judgment of others, except for one. What motivates your heart in worship? Are you here in your own terms, worshiping in your own way? Do you find yourself driven by a desire for comfort and convenience in worship? I don't mean that we should try to be uncomfortable or attempt the best we can to make things inconvenient, but what is it that is driving us? Am I driven by desire just to make an appearance? Or is it for holiness? Am I here? Are you here? Are we here clearly and obviously to worship God together as His people in a way that pleases Him and invites others to do the same? Invites others to come and have fellowship with God, to enjoy the friendship of God. Brothers and sisters, last thing right here. Jesus takes the worship of His Father seriously, and so must we. I believe we do, and I'm very grateful for that. But let us be open to the Spirit's correction in whatever ways we need to grow and mature. And let us thank God that Jesus bore our reproach, and in Him we have access to our Heavenly Father.